Welcome to episode 2 of our second series of treasures from the Rabbi's Library. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd especially like to thank our sponsors today, Bob Zeller and Nadine Gerson. Nadine is sponsoring this episode in memory of her father, Yehuda Leib ben Avraham, Zichron Levracha. The yortzeit is tonight and tomorrow. The neshama should have an aliyah. We should all be zocheh to see tchias hamesim. I'd also like to dedicate this particular episode to the memory of my mother, Miriam Chana Tikva, Bas Uri Yehuda HaKohen. She died 14 years ago today. Today is her yortzeit, and I hope I am making her proud. So you'll tell me afterwards if this episode and any of the episodes that I have broadcast have done her memory any justice, but certainly her neshama should have an aliyah. I look forward to seeing her at tchias hamesim. Today we're going to focus on something that always grabs people's attention when they come into my office, to my library. I'm going to show it to you. It's a very, very large book. Can you see this book? This book here is something that sits on my shelf or on the table. And people are always asking me, what's that book? It's the biggest book I've ever seen. The truth is, it's not actually a book. What it is a filing cabinet. And I'll explain to you what that means, because if you open it up, I'm going to show you, you'll see that I have in here a collection of files. It's not actually files. What it is all types of documents and things that were issued during the course of Jewish history, which denote or connote aspects of Jewish historical episodes. In Yiddish, the word that we use, I don't know if it's Yiddish actually, but it's the word that is widely used in Yerushalayim. It's pashkevilim. It's posters that contain information. It's the means of communication in communities which don't use regular media. And usually it's one-sided posters or handbills, and they're extremely important. If you want to understand Jewish history, you can understand or at least appreciate or gain access to many aspects of the most intricate parts of Jewish history via handbills and via printed leaflets and pamphlets that were on one-sided posters, pashkevilim, that were issued throughout Jewish history. And very often we look to books or we look to documents, but another source of information, a huge resource if you are a Jewish historian, is pashkevilim, posters, because you can really work out and calculate exactly what was going on by the opinions that were expressed and information that was contained and is contained in these elaborate posters that were issued by different opposing partisan sides in a dispute relating to the Jewish historical episodes that they reflect. So today I'm going to look at this particular book. It's not really a book, as I've explained. I don't think we're going to get through that many of them, and hopefully in future episodes we'll look at some more. But at least today, let's try and look. By the way, this particular book doesn't just contain pashkevilim, it contains all kinds of things that I've collected over the years, but it's contained in these very convenient plastic folders, I don't know what to call them, these pages in which you can put just single sheets of paper or photographs, and I've contained them. I've got hundreds of these contained in several books, some of them bigger, some of them smaller, and I have written about each and every one of them. I have written a description, and hopefully through the course of today's episode we will get through some of them, and I hope that they will interest you. I've tried, it's random, but I've tried in every aspect of the descriptions that I've written to give as much information as I can about Jewish historical episodes, because I am a lover of Jewish history. I believe that the essence of the Jewish people and the culture of the Jewish people and the character of the Jewish people is contained in its history. If we understand history, if we understand why people reacted to certain situations in a particular way, we understand who we are and why we are like we are. And that's so important. So I'm opening this file today and this book, and we're going to go through as many pieces as we can get through, and you'll see that I have collated information about each and every piece that I've collected. And I want to tell you, I have thousands upon thousands of these pashkevilim and posters and pamphlets that I have contained in these files. And we're not going to get through thousands today, or even hundreds. We may get through 5 or 10, and hopefully by getting through those 5 or 10, you will understand why I am so fascinated by each and every episode in Jewish history as reflected through the publications or whatever it is that is related to it that I have in my collection. So the first piece that I'm going to show you today is called, it's the first one in this file, it's called Mitzvah Lefarsem. Here it is. I don't know if you can see that in this, quite bright, the light. Do you want to lower the light maybe? Carly, I'm not sure if the light may be a little bit too bright to be able to see it. Mitzvah Lefarsem. It's a poster that was published in Jerusalem in the 1920s. Now I have to tell you that the person who issued the poster was a man called he was Rabbi Yosef Gershon Horowitz. You won't have heard of him. He's not a name that was widely recognized. He was born in 1869. He died in 1951. He was a rabbi in Jerusalem. He was the. Have you ever been to the Rehavia district of Jerusalem, opposite the? I think it's used to be called the Sheraton Plaza Hotel. It now has a different name, the Leonardo. And there's a shul there called Yeshurun Shul. It became the main shul of the chief rabbinate of Jerusalem. But even before the chief rabbis of Jerusalem davened in Yeshurun Shul, and by the way, I send my fondest regards to David Braga, who is the gabbai and the chief cook and bottle washer of the Yeshurun Shul in Jerusalem. He's a dear friend. His family were friendly with my family from Munk's Shul in Golders Green. I don't know if he's on this Zoom live, but hopefully he'll be watching this on YouTube. And he is the man who runs Yeshurun Shul. Also behind Yeshurun Shul, within that building, is Yad HaRav Herzog, and they of course published my latest book, which was a republication of Rav Shmuel Yitzchak Hillman's drushes on Bereshis. And they're flying off the shelves in Jerusalem. If anybody's interested in obtaining a copy, it's not so easy to get them because of the COVID situation, but you can email me, pinnydunner@gmail.com. I will get you a copy of the Or HaYosha on Bereshis, which contains a monograph biography of Rav Shmuel Yitzchak Hillman, who was one of the Gedolim of the 20th century. And it was co-written by me and Rabbi Yechiel Goldhaber. So please let me know if you would like to obtain a copy, and I will see if I can get you a copy, even in the midst of this very difficult situation. Yeshurun Shul was actually opened long before Chief Rabbi Herzog became the chief rabbi and began davening there. And the rabbi of Yeshurun Shul was a man called Rabbi Yosef Gershon Horowitz. And he issued this poster, which I've just shown you, and I'll show you again. Here it is. It's Mitzvah Lefarsem. What is Mitzvah Lefarsem all about? It's a circular that he wanted to have just distributed around the Jewish world. He was a big supporter of Rav Kook. He was also the Rosh Yeshiva. If you've ever been to Meir She'arim, to that area of Jerusalem, you'll know that there's the Meir Sha'arim Yeshiva and Talmud Torah, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva. Now, just to give you just some context as to what the situation was in those days, he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Meir Sha'arim. I want to show you what he looked like. This is a picture of Rav Yosef Gershon Horowitz. Okay, so this is what he looked like. He was, in every aspect of the way he lived his life, a Haredi Jew. He was also a strong supporter of Mizrahi, and he was a very close friend of Rav Kook. We always think that Rav Kook was somehow an outsider in Yerushalayim. Not at all. He was considered the Rav, the rabbi of all the Jews of Jerusalem, and it was the Kanoim, it was the Zealots who were considered the outsiders because they rejected the leadership of Rav Kook after he was appointed the chief rabbi of Jerusalem in 1919, and I think around 1920-21 he was appointed the chief rabbi of Palestine by the British Mandate authorities, or at least by the Vad Le'umi. We'll talk about that another time. But Rav Kook was widely accepted by all the Rabbonim and all the Frum Jews of Yerushalayim as representing their interests. In any event, this Rav Horowitz was extremely angry by Reb Moshe Blau, by the things that he wrote in his Kol Yisrael, which was an Agudas Yisrael publication. In those days, Agudas Yisrael, I don't have them here, but I have a number of Kol Yisrael publications. The Kol Yisrael, which was the official organ of the Agudas Yisrael in Israel, was very anti-Zionist, and anybody who was a supporter of Zionism or of any kind of Jewish nationalism or aspirations for a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael were considered to be absolute anathema. And Rav Moshe Blau represented them. Agudas Yisrael, of course, changed its position in the late 1940s when they became tacitly supportive of the creation of the State of Israel. That was a huge break from the way that they'd been behaving for the previous 20 years. But at the time that this was written, this mitzvah lefarseim, that this was written, this was a poster that was published in 1922, and it was sent all over the world. What was it? You know that because Reb Moshe Blau had written what he had written, there were Rabbonim who were very angry with him, mainly Litvaks. So the main supporters of Rav Kook were Litvak Rabbonim. And the person who wrote the letter that is in Mitzvah Lefarseim was a man called Rav Hodus, Rabbi Yukosil Isser Hodus. He was the former rabbi of Meshat in Lithuania, and he expressed his absolute horror at what was contained in Kol Yisrael, and because it always had attacks on Rav Kook and his associates, and as a result of the fact that Kol Yisrael was distributed widely across the Jewish world, this poster was printed and sent across the Jewish world. And Rav Hodus writes extremely disparagingly about those who criticize Rav Kook, and he says that despite the fact that this group makes a lot of noise, they represent just a tiny minority of the Shomrei Torah and mitzvahs in the Eretz Yisrael Jewish community. He also adds, and this is really interesting, that Rav Yerucham Diskin, Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin, was the son of the Rav of Brisk, Maharil Diskin, who came to Eretz Yisrael in the 1800s, and he took over the Diskin family heritage. So he says everybody calls him Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabbi. He's not a rabbi. He's never been the rabbi of a community. His father was the rabbi of Brisk and moved to Eretz Yisrael. He has no right to express an opinion on Rav Kook. And what about Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld? He said Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld has never been the rabbi of a community. He's never led a shul or a community or any kind of group. He is a political individual. He has absolutely no right to present his opinions as to what Rav Kook should or shouldn't do. In any event, they were, as far as Rav Hodus was concerned, and in this particular piece, which I'm showing you today, this mitzvah of Phariseim, he says that Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Rabbi Yitzchak Elchonon and all their supporters are completely inappropriate because neither of these two, as he called them, elderly men, zakenim, have ever officiated as rabbis in their lives. So that's the first piece I've got here in the file. By the way, here's a picture of Rav Hodus. He was a very choshev Rav. He was born in 1849. He died in 1924, and he was a distinguished Litvischer Rav in Yerushalayim during this particular period when Rav Kook was beginning to gain traction as a leader of the Jewish community, of the Frum Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael, and he was a very strong supporter of Rav Kook. And this letter, which was issued by Rav Horovitz, was something that he had written to support Rav Kook. Let's go to the next piece. Oh, this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So you know something that I have a particular interest in what's called Americana. What's Americana? Americana is anything, any kind of Jewish material which has an American origin. What does that mean? That the American Jewish community were extremely successful and productive for many, many years, but they didn't really produce much printed or published material. And it wasn't until the late 1800s that the immigrant community began producing Sforim, not really Sforim, at that stage it was just booklets and pamphlets. The first real Sforim only appeared at the beginning of the 1900s, and the publishers of these Sforim were mainly based on the East Coast. There were some in Chicago and elsewhere in the Midwest where there were strong Jewish communities. And those, the representatives of the Frum Jewish community were mainly based on the East Coast. Now, what type of community was there in America in those days? It's an interesting question, right? Who was it who moved from Europe to America? It's easy for us to believe that those people who were Frum in Europe and moved to America remained Frum in America. It's not the case at all. Most of the Jewish immigrants that came to the United States, within a matter of a few years, had abandoned their close observance of Jewish law. Why? Because it was no longer convenient and there was no peer pressure. If you lived in Europe and you lived in a Frum Jewish community, you had to observe Jewish law. If you moved to America and you lived in New York, as long as you were basically observant, and it's an interesting question as to what that means. It very often meant eating kosher food and coming to shul on regular occasions. But in essence, the Frum Jewish life, the orthodox Jewish life of American Jewry was not strong at all. Now, as a result of that, those Rabbonim, the rabbis who came from Europe to America, very often had to accommodate themselves to the realities of what it meant to be a rabbi to a community that wasn't really that religious, which meant that the level of imposition that they imposed on their community members was not that strong. What happened when somebody who was really strong in their Yiddishkeit and was a rabbi moved to the United States? They imagined that they could somehow create a community that would reflect the frumness of a community in Europe. it was extremely hard. It wasn't really until the 1940s and 1950s when that became strong and possible. And it was really through the introduction of those who were involved in forced immigration because of Nazi overrun Europe, and who had come to America, that the Frumkeit, the religious observance of Jews in America, really changed. And the Frum Jewish community of America today is not really descended, as it were, from the rabbinic leadership or from the lay leadership of Frum Jewish leaders of the early 20th century and the late 19th century. Now, there were two rabbinic organizations which had a very strong influence at the beginning of the 20th century. One of them is very well known for those of you who have studied Jewish history. It's called the Agudas Harabonim. But the other one is the Knesset Harabonim. And here we have something which is a publication, 4-page publication. Here I'm going to show it to you. It's a 4-page publication of the Knesset Harabonim, which was led by a man called Velvele Margolies, Rav Gavriel Zev Margolies. He was born in 1847. He died in 1935. And this publication was published in 1932 in honor of Rav Margolies' 85th birthday. It's an extraordinary 4-sided document. It's not really a pashkevil, it's more of a pamphlet or a journal. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. Let me just open it up for you so you can see all parts of it. Here it is. And here's the back page. It's a very, very rare pamphlet. You won't find it. If you go to auction houses, you're not going to find this. This is not something that you can easily obtain. Let me tell you a little bit about Rav Margolies. He was an extremely influential Orthodox rabbinic leader in the United States. He arrived in 1907. He had served more than 30 years, listen to this, more than 30 years as a rabbi in Europe. And you know what? 27 of those years, he was the Av Bezdin, the Rav of Grodno in Lithuania, which was an extremely important Litvak community. And he was by nature extremely conservative. He was a real stickler for strict halachic observance. And when he moved to America, he made every effort in his various roles over the years to bring the standard of orthodoxy up to par with the orthodoxy that he knew from Europe, in the heartlands of Jewish life in Europe. And he'd come from Lithuania, where being Jewish obviously was very strong, and the Frum communities there were fully observant. Those who came to America were in a self-selecting sense, not that interested in their Yiddishkeit. Even if they were interested in their Frumkeit, it was not to the level, and the amount of people who were interested in maintaining the standards of Yiddishkeit just didn't match the ability or capability of somebody like Rav Margolies to ensure that those standards were kept up. Now, in this publication, it's called, here, look at the title. It's called A Ewige Historische Dokument. And in this publication, he criticizes a number of his colleagues by name. Why? Because he feels that they are compromising from orthodox halachic observant standards. And those leaders were the leaders of the Agudas Harabonim, which was the competing organization to the Knesset Harabonim. One of them was Rabbi Silva, who was the Rav in Cincinnati. He was born in 1882. He was a Litvische Godel. He moved to America in the early 1900s, eventually ending up in Cincinnati. He'd been a Rav in Springfield. He'd been a Rav in a number of places. but he ended up in Cincinnati. He became the head of the Agudas Rabbonim. He was an extremely charismatic individual, but here criticized by Rav Velvele Margolies for compromising the standards. Rav Laser Silver died in 1968. Another one was Rabbi Yisrael Rosenberg. He was Rav in New Jersey. He was a very prominent member of the Agudas Rabbonim. And he says here, Rav Margolies says, I put these Rabbonim and anyone associated with them in Cherem. I excommunicate them. Why? Because they've done terrible Averis. Their misdeeds, their Averis amounted to encroaching onto the territory of their colleagues who were trying to ensure that halachas and the Jewish law was kept up in the proper fashion. And he felt that they had abrogated their responsibilities and somehow they had compromised to such a level that they were no longer worthy of titling themselves as rabbis. And he was particularly angry here, and this of course is personal and subjective, with Rabbi Rosenberg, Rabbi Yisrael Rosenberg, because he'd encroached onto the territory of Rav Margolies' son, Rav Menashe Margolies. Anyway, an extremely rare pamphlet about an extremely interesting situation in the American rabbinate. Here's a picture of Rav Margolies. He went to the White House in the early 1920s. I think the president at that time was President Taft. And he went together with a man called Rabbi Avraham Aaron Yudelovich. And I want to tell you that Rabbi Yudelovich is going to be the focus of my attention in a future episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. So Rav Margolies was an incredibly important figure in the early Orthodox Jewish community of the 20th century. And he tried very, very hard to maintain, sustain, and promote standards of Jewish orthodoxy to a limited amount of success. But he published Sforim, and he was a fighter for the cause, as it were, and his memory is certainly worth reminding ourselves of, because he was an incredibly important figure in the history of Jewish orthodoxy in the United States. I just want to say that Rabbi Moshe Sherman wrote his dissertation on Rav Velvele Margolies. I don't know if it's available online, but if it is, it's worth reading. I have a copy of it, and it's very, very informative about those early years of American Jewish orthodoxy. Let me come to the next item here in my file, in my book, and it's number 3 in my list of things that I'm going to talk about today, and that is the photographs. I love photographs. By the way, I'm a huge collector of photographs. I don't know if you know, you've listened to my podcasts or my video casts in the past on YouTube. You've seen whatever it is that I've put out. But I love photographs. One of the people I associate myself with very, very strongly, and who's been a great help to me in providing photographs for some of the lectures that I've given, is Moshe Yarmish. He's always looking for photographs of Rabbonim that he doesn't yet have. He has, I believe, the largest collection of historical photographs of Rabbonim in the world, and mainly 20th century, but not excluding 19th century Rabbonim. But he himself used to take photographs in the 1970s and 1980s of the Gedolim. Many of the photographs of Rav Moshe Feinstein that we know are taken or were taken by Moshe Yarmish. And he is an incredible collector, extremely knowledgeable, and if you ever need a photograph of a rabbi identified, he can help. And I'm happy that I've been able to provide him with some photographs that he doesn't have, and he has, of course, managed to provide me on many occasions with photographs that I didn't have. But here are some photographs, not of Rabbonim. Here are some photographs which I'm not sure because of the lighting. Can you see that? It's okay. This is a photograph of Gateshead Yeshiva, and this is a photograph of Gateshead Yeshiva in Teves Tovshin Lamed Beis, end of 1961, beginning of this is Tovshin Chof base, the end of 1961, beginning of 1962. So you get a photograph like this, and you can see it. And of course, the great Rosh Hashivas of Gateshead are there, Reb Leib, Reb Leib Gurvitz. You can see there, Reb Avraham Gurvitz, of course, still leads Gateshead Yeshiva as a very young man. I believe that that you have other people on there. You have the Menal of Gateshead Yeshiva, who was still alive, Rav Kahan. He's on there. Reb Zev Cohen, who was his son-in-law, who was nifter about 7-8 years ago. He is also on this photograph, and Reb Moshe Schwab, who was the Menal of Gateshead Yeshiva. He is also on this photograph. But the thing is that the photograph is not just of the Rosh Hashivas. Can you see that? It's of all the people in the yeshiva. What do you do with a photo like this? So you could just keep it in your file and say, isn't this great? I've got a picture of Gateshead Yeshiva in 1961 or 1962, and how fantastic it is that I have the opportunity of having this photograph, and I can see these great rabbonim on the front row sitting, and 5 or 6 people I can identify. That's not good enough for Rabbi Dunner, because I don't just like identifying 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people on a photograph. If there's 100 or 200 people on a photograph, I want to be able to identify as many people as I can. So here you go. I'm going to show you something, and I'd encourage anyone who's watching this who can help me identify more people to do so. This is what I did. I reproduced the photograph, painted over all the faces with Tipex. Remember Tipex? And I wrote numbers on every single one of the faces, and underneath is a list. And I've got here, I would say, about 2/3 at least of all the people in Gateshead Yeshiva in 1961 are recorded here. I'm going to read you some of the names. Meir Wilensky, Mani Kanitsky, Chaim Gurvitz, who is now one of the Rosh Hashivas of Gateshead. He's on this photograph. I've identified him. David Mapper, Shlomo Rosenbaum, Hillel Landy, Jackie Rosenzweig, David Schwartz. One of the people in the photograph is my uncle, Dayan Aaron David Dunner, who's one of the Dayanim of the London Beis Din. I mean, he's now 80 years old, but in 1961, he was a young bocher in Lakewood Yeshiva. Eli Salomon, Yitzhak Rabinovitz, Tony Bloom. You've got here Azriel Salomon, who was a brother of Rab Matisyahu. Stanley Izovsky, he was the secretary of Gateshead Yeshiva for many years. I think he's passed away. I don't know. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Lenny Book, Alan Cohen, Yehuda Chesner, Alan Plancy, who is a rabbi in London for many, many years in Boreham Wood. He's on this photograph. I've identified every single person. I want to tell you something. That one of the great tasks that we have when we are recording history is not just to record the details of what happened, but also to record the details of who people are. And sometimes those side people, those marginal people, are very, very important. And here we have a fantastic photograph, a photograph of Gateshead Yeshiva in its heyday. Some might say today is its heyday, but in the 1960s, it was the premier yeshiva in Europe. People never went to Eretz Yisrael. They came to Gateshead. They graduated from Gateshead to Gateshead Kollel. They became Rabbonim. Gateshead Yeshiva was the most important institution in Europe, training young, frum, Jewish men to study, to learn Gemara, and to go through whatever it was in the learning that they needed to do in order to train themselves to be an example for the next generation. And here we have those people. It's not that many people. I'd love to know who they are. And I don't just have this picture. I have another picture as well. This one I haven't worked on identifying, and this one is from Tovshin Chof Zayin. Tovshin Chof Zayin, and it's the same pose in the same dining room, by the way, that when I was in Gateshead Yeshiva, that I used to eat my lunch and my dinner, and I don't know if it still exists today, but there it was when I was in Yeshiva in the late 1980s. This dining room still existed, and here they are composing the Bochrim of Gateshead Yeshiva. And here we have all these same Rabbonim, but I think this time, I'm just looking here if it includes Rav Matisyahu Solomon. No, I think he only came a year later. Now, of course, he's in Lakewood, he's a mashgiach in Lakewood Yeshiva. Let's go on to the next piece, which I have here in my file. So, it's fascinating. Does anyone know who this is? Do you know who this is? Have you ever seen this picture? This is Rav Naftali Hermann Adler. Rav Naftali Hermann Adler, I've actually finished an article, both in Lashon HaKodesh and in English. The Lashon HaKodesh version is going to be published in Kovetz Eitz Chaim, I think in Nissan, and the English version is going to be published in Chakirah, which is also a rabbinic publication, a rabbinic journal, and it really concerns Rav Shmuel Yitzchak Hillman's battle against somebody I've been researching for many years, whose name was Yosef Shapochnik. I've spoken about him in a previous episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. But at the beginning, I talk about this man, and his name is Rav Naftali Hermann Adler. He was the chief rabbi of the UK, of Great Britain, and at that time the British Empire, which stretched across the world, and he was one of the most important rabbinic figures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Interestingly enough, even though he was, I wouldn't say assimilated, but he was very comfortable in an assimilated world, he was very anti-Zionist. He's quoted in Or Yesharim, which was the first major publication against Zionism, a lecture, a sermon that he gave in the late 1800s against Zionism, was translated into Lashon HaKodesh and published in Or Yesharim because it was so strong in its vehement condemnation of Zionism. This man, his father, was Reb Nosson Marcus Adler. He had been the Rav, the chief rabbi of Hanover in Germany, and he was appointed the chief rabbi of Great Britain and the British Empire during the reign of Queen Victoria. In 1845, he presided over the creation of a government-recognized Orthodox community that's the main Jewish community of the United Kingdom to this day, called the United Synagogue. And this was his son. He studied in Prague. He got smicha in Prague from Shlomo Yehuda Leib Rappaport, who was the son-in-law of the Ktsois, of course, one of the early Maskilim. I think I've discussed him as well in previous episodes of Treasures and other lectures that I've given. And he was somebody who was comfortable in rabbinic studies, but was very comfortable as well in the assimilated world of those who had abandoned the practices and the observances of the Shulchan Aruch. Rav Hermann Adler, because he was the chief rabbi, refused to allow anybody else to call themselves rabbi in his community. Absolutely refused. If you were a rabbi, you were called reverend. You weren't allowed to be called rabbi. There was only one rabbi in the whole of the United Kingdom and in the British Empire. Do you know who that was? It was none other than Chief Rabbi Hermann Adler. He was allowed to be called rabbi. He was a chief rabbi, but there were no rabbis. And that was because he felt that any challenge to his authority would mean the end of the Jewish community. He had seen so many communities in Europe fracture and fall apart because of machlokas, and therefore nobody else was allowed to challenge his authority. He was the ultimate, in fact, the only authority, rabbinic authority for the Jewish community of Great Britain during his tenure as chief rabbi. Well, not really, because of course there were many Haredim, there were many very frum Jews who moved to England and moved particularly to London because it was an incredibly important commercial centre, and they were frum, and they established their own community. It was called Machzikei Hadas. And in 1891, these more recently arrived Haredi Jewish immigrants in London, they seceded from the main community. And this community, Machzikei Hadas, came into being. And one of the main causes of the split between the Chief Rabbi Adler's community and the Machzikei Hadas community was that they were extremely dissatisfied with the supervision of Shechita standards. Shechita, it's the heart of what it means to be a Jew, to eat kosher meat. You want to make sure that the meat that you're eating is kosher. But if the sheichtim or the butchers are substandard, are subpar, then you can't eat. What are you meant to eat? You need your protein, right? We all love our meat. We all want to have a good chicken for Friday night dinner. If you can't have chicken, how can you be a good Jew? And so they set themselves apart from Hermann Adler and his Beis Din, and they said that all the meat that's under their supervision is no good, and they created their own shechita, the Machzikei Hadas shechita. This is in the 1890s. It became a massive machlokus, and the truth is they were absolutely right. Why were they right? Because Hermann Adler wasn't particularly interested in the kashrus of his community. He was interested in making sure that overall the Jewish community was going to be orthodox and it wouldn't fall under the influence of the reform. And if there were certain practices or certain behaviors within that community, within his frum so-called orthodox community, which weren't really up to standard, well, we'll sort it out. But if you split, all that's going to happen is that mainstream English Jewish life is going to fall under the influence of reform. So that was his, I guess, excuse for the fact that the shechita under his so-called supervision was not really as good as it should be. But in any event, he protested and fought against those who criticized him vigorously. And this is here, this is the next piece which I'm showing you. This piece is a piece which was produced by Chief Rabbi Adler in the early 1890s, in 1891, which contains a letter from Rav Yitzchak Elchonon, Spectre of Kovna. Now, you all know that Rav Yitzchak Elchonon Spectre was the leading posek of his generation. He wasn't just the Rav of Kovna, but people consulted him from all over the world. They knew that he was one of the great rabbis of his generation. And what did Rabbi Yitzchak Elchonon Spectre do? Did he support the Machzikei Hadas? Now, automatically we feel that Rabbi Yitzchak Elchonon Spectre would of course support the Machzikei Hadas, because he wants to make sure to uphold the highest standards of shechita, and that there shouldn't be anybody who never would have to eat non-kosher meat. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchonon Spectre would certainly stand up for the frum Jews of London who were protesting against the lax standards of Rabbi Hermann Adler, but that's not the case at all. He was the leading posek of the time, and he condemned the new kahila, the Machzikei Hadas, in the strongest possible terms. He said, how can you separate yourselves from this community, this Orthodox community? How can you offend the honor of my dear friend, Chief Rabbi Naftali Hermann Adler? I have to tell you, this episode, I'm only talking about it here for a minute or two. It's extensively covered in a book, which is an extremely important book, written by the grandson of the Rav of Machzikei Hadas. The Rav was called Rabbi Avraham Abba Werner. He had been a rabbi in Telz. Later on, he was in Finland, and he came to London. He was the Rav for the last 20 years of his life in Machzikei Hadas, an exceptional individual. And his grandson, Bernard Homer, who I remember, he lived in Golders Green in London. He died in 1991 at the age of 90. He wrote a book, A Fortress in Anglo Jewry. I don't know if you can find it online on ABE Books, on Amazon. If you can, it's worth obtaining the book, because he extensively covers this particular episode in the Jewish history of the UK, and this particular I don't know, Pashkeville, I guess, issued by Rabbi Adler, he only publishes one side of it in as the handbill on page 122 of that book. It's worth buying the book if you can get hold of it. It's extremely interesting. Let's look at the next piece. So the next piece is called Mi Lashem Elai. You know the expression Mi Lashem Elai. What's Mi Lashem Elai? Mi Lashem Elai is the call of Moshe Rabbeinu, and he says to the Jewish people, those who reject idolatry, those who reject paganism, those who reject everything that is antithesis to Judaism should come to me. Mi Lashem Elai. Those who are for God, come to me. And it's often used as the headline for posters which are extremely polemical in nature. This particular one, Mi Lashem Elai, can you see it? I don't know if the reflection here is it possible to see it? Yeah. It's okay. Okay, Mi Lashem Elai. It was published in Moinesti in Romania in 1909. And it's a two-sided, it's on the other side as well, it's a two-sided pashkavil about a controversy in Romania between a Rav there called Rabbi Avraham Leib Rosen. He was born in 1870, he died in 1952, he survived the Holocaust. Here's a picture of Rav Rosen, Rabbi Avraham Leib Rosen. And it's against a group of local sheikhtim, of those who do shechita, who slaughter animals for kosher meat. And they've broken away from his control and they've formed their own, as it were, rabbinic supervision, shechita, not different than the machzike hadas. And they were performing also other rabbinic duties. I suspect that they were also doing weddings and divorces and Dinei Torah, court cases that were being brought before them, and they were challenging his authority. He was the Rav of Moinesti. And Rav Rosen claims in this poster that he has the support of 45 rabbonim, 45 other rabbis, for his quest to have the matter between him and these people who'd split from his community to be dealt with by a din Torah, by being brought in front of rabbinic authority. And he includes in there the rabbis of Brody, of Yazlevitz, of Stanislav, Bichach, Haradenka, Yagalitzia, and Zalishtik, and many others. He lists all the different places where rabbis of communities had come out in support of him, seeing this case between him and those who opposed him and were challenging his authority being brought in front of a Beis Din. And I have to say that on my version here, and I don't know if there's another copy of this in the world. I absolutely do not know. I've never seen another copy, but there's a handwritten note here. Don't know if you can see it. There's a handwritten note on the side, and I believe that it's in the hand of none other than Rav Rosen himself. And he says that besides for the 45 rabbis he puts in the printed poster, there's another 18 rabbis who had confirmed the support for him in writing, including the chief rabbis of Minsk and Apt. And below is the text of a letter, presumably the one signed by his rabbinic colleagues, in which his opponents are severely criticized for their conduct, for having come out with an alternative rabbinic supervision, etc., without having established their right to do so. And at the conclusion of the text, Rabbi Rosen offers anyone reading the poster to come and see for themselves all the signatures, the support signatures that he got from his rabbinic colleagues. He says at home, I will show anyone that these rabbis have supported me. I'm not making it up. And that's what he did. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Rabbi Avraham Leib Rosen. He was a very great man. He was one of the main rabbonim in Romania before the Second World War. A very, very great person. He was a Chortkova Chosid. You know, there was a Chortkova Rebbe from the Rosen dynasty, and he was a Chortkova Chosid in Moinesti, Romania. You know, there were many of the Rosen Hasidim, of the Hasidic groups that were loyal to Rosen, were based in Romania, and he was a rabbi in Romania, and he himself, he wasn't a rebbe, but he was a Chortgever Chassid, and he was known as a massive Talmud Chacham, and also as a person who had a very friendly disposition to anybody who came to him. But he was also known, renowned, for his unbending defense of Jewish law and Jewish tradition. Now, why is he so interesting? Because not only was he himself a Choshev Rav, but his son, Rabbi Moshe Rosen, became, after the Second World War, the chief rabbi of Romania. That was during a time when Romania was under communist control. Rabbi Moshe Rosen, who was born in 1912, he died in 1994, was the chief rabbi of Romania. Romania was an interesting country that, even though it was part of the Eastern Bloc, the president of Romania was a man called Ceausescu, and he didn't always agree with everything the Soviet Union did. He ran his own show, and Rabbi Rosen was a very good friend of his. Many people say that Rabbi Rosen, through his work with the Joint Distribution Committee, had contacts with the CIA. But in any event, he was extremely effective at making sure that anybody who wanted to emigrate to Eretz Yisrael, to go on Aliyah, to become an Israeli citizen, he was able to do so. And at a time when no other Jewish person living in the Eastern Bloc countries was able to move to Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Rosen was always able to arrange visas for Romanian Jews who wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael. And whenever there was difficult situations with regard to Jews in Romania, Rabbi Rosen would go to Ceausescu and he would make sure that he could resolve them. And he, I guess, was considered, after the downfall of Ceausescu, was considered very controversial. He never had any children. He died in 1994. He was an extremely interesting man, and perhaps we'll devote another episode of Treasures or one of my lectures to the life of Rabbi Rosen. I think we're going to look at one more piece today, and let's look at this one here. Devarim K'Moshe Hein. I think this is very interesting because you know that there's very often there are disputes as to who should be the chief rabbi of a particular place. You know that whenever a chief rabbi retires or passes away, there's a discussion about who should be the chief rabbi. I have here a piece. It's called Devarim K'Moshe Hein. Devarim K'Moshe Hein is it's fascinating. It's signed by, I'm going to show it to you. Can you see this here? It's signed by Rav Shmuel Salant and Rav Chaim Berlin. So you imagine it must be a poster, a pashkavil, with regard to some Ashkenazi problem that existed where Rav Shmuel Salant was Rav in Yerushalayim. Rav Chaim Berlin was meant to be his replacement. Of course, he died before Rav Shmuel Salant. That's another story. But it's not about an Ashkenaz dispute. It's about a Sephardi dispute. This was Devarim K'Moshe Hein is a declaration by these two Rabbonim that they don't wish to get involved in the dispute with regard to the replacement of the Sephardic chief rabbi in Yerushalayim. Who was the Sephardic chief rabbi? The Sephardic chief rabbi was somebody called Harav Panigel, Elio Panigel. And Rav Panigel was a very, very great rabbi. And in those days, Palestine, Eretz Yisrael, was part of the Ottoman Empire. And I guess that the Chacham Bashi, who was the chief rabbi at that time of the Ottoman Empire, and his name was Rabbi Chaim Nachum. Rabbi Chaim Nachum was not happy with Rabbi Eliyahu Panigel. He felt that he wasn't deferring to him enough in matters relating to the Sephardic Jewish community in Yerushalayim, and he wanted to replace Rav Panigel with somebody else. Now, it happens to be that Rav Panigel got on very well with the Ashkenazi community. Rav Nachum wanted to replace, and by the way, it was this was a conspiracy that was put together between Rav Nachum and this man here. His name was Albert Antebi. He was a very, very prominent, wealthy Jew of the Ottoman Empire. And he, together with Rabbi Nachum, conspired to depose Rav Panigel from his post. This is in 1909, as the chief Sephardic rabbi of Yerushalayim. So in those days, there was the Chacham Bashi, who was the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire, which was a huge territory. And then they had a rabbi who was, I guess, at a secondary level to the Chacham Bashi, who is called the Rishon LeZion. The Rishon LeZion was the chief rabbi of the Palestinian Sephardic Jewish community, but it was a bit of a nebuch position because that community was not considered very strong. It was much better to be the rabbi of the community in Turkey, or to be the rabbi of the community in Syria, or to be the rabbi of the community in Egypt. Who wants to be the rabbi of the community in Palestine? It's a bit of a nebuch community. But Rav Panigel, who'd been a Rav in Yerushalayim for many years, he became the chief rabbi. And then a year after he became the chief rabbi in 1908, the Rishon LeZion, 1909, Albert Antebi and Rabbi Nachum wanted to depose him. And they wanted to replace him with a man called Rav Chizkiah Shabbatai. That's the man they wanted to replace him with. Well, you know what? They sought the help of the Ashkenaz community. They said, listen, you need us. We can bring your needs and your concerns and your demands and your desires to the authorities in Istanbul. So better support us in our attempt to depose Rav Panigel. This is the response of the Ashkenazi community. This is the letter that was published and sent out by Rav Chaim Berlin and Rav Shmuel Salant. They refused to get involved. They felt that Rabbi Shabbatai was a substandard rabbi, even though, by the way, he was a Talmud Chacham, but because he was willing to be manipulated by Balabatim and by Rabbonim who had other agendas, they refused to cooperate, and they wrote this letter, Koiles boim eleinu ma'achenu Hayrosh Bagoyla Hamairi Maisonu Baruch Tahara Lischazek Lagen al Kvoiter Asena Kdoisha Velil Chaim Milchemes Mitzvah Neged Elo Aporitzim Chaimas HaTorah Lahirid Goin V'Tzadik. And who they're talking about? They're talking about none other than Rav Panigel. They refused to cooperate. Rav Panigel remained the chief rabbi. It was an abortive attempt. For a very short period of time, officially, Rav Shabbatai was the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, but Rav Panigel was kept on. He was a fantastic person, and it's another interesting story that perhaps we should explore at another time, who the chief rabbis of the Sephardic community of Eretz Yisrael were, and how they maintained the standards of frumkeit for the Sephardic community, and how they accommodated themselves to the growth, the enormous growth of the Ashkenazi community during the early years of the 20th century, and how they accommodated themselves as well with Zionism and with the creation of the State of Israel. But I think I've run out of time. I'm extremely grateful to you for having tuned in. I'd like to ask you all to subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you go to the bottom right hand of your screen, you can find a click button where you can press and click using your mouse, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'd love to have you watch all my videos, not just this one, and I look forward to welcoming you to my next episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. And once again, let me thank Nadine Gerson, our sponsors, Nadine Gerson and Bob Zeller, for the sponsorship of this particular episode in memory of Leon Gerson, Yehuda Leib and Avraham, Zichrona Livracha. May his neshama have an aliyah, and may we be zoichet to see Tchias HaMesim. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library.